Grand Admiral Kreshvanar stood on the command deck of the Eternal Bulwark, his 4 eyes fixed on the great viewing screen. The flagship of the Vorthak Empire was a mountain of metal, floating in space. Its hull was 40 meters thick. Its armor had been tested against every weapon known to the galaxy. No ship had ever broken through it. No ship ever would. The Admiral was old, even for his species. He had served the 8 spires for 200 standard years. In all that time, he had never lost a battle. He had never even seen a Vorthak ship damaged in combat. The reason was simple. The Vorthak built walls, the best walls in the known galaxy. For 3,000 years, his people had followed one rule above all others. Armor wins wars. Speed could be matched. Weapons could be copied. But armor, true armor, was a question of patience and craft. The Vorthak had spent generations perfecting the layered crystalline alloy that made up their hulls. They had woven energy-dispersing fields into every plate. They had built ships that could fly through stars and come out the other side. A young officer approached him with a data tablet. His scales were still bright green with youth. His name was Tovak, and he served as the fleet's intelligence officer. "Grand Admiral," Tovak said, bowing low. "The reports you requested, the species called humans." Kreshvanar took the tablet in one of his 4 hands. He read in silence for a long moment. Then he made a low, rumbling sound that, in his species, meant amusement. "This must be a joke," he said. "These ships have almost no armor at all." "No joke, Grand Admiral. Our scouts have observed 7 of their warships at close range. The hulls are made of cold-rolled steel and ceramic plating, less than 2 meters thick at the heaviest point." 2 meters. Kreshvanar laughed openly now. "A Vorthak shuttle has thicker armor than that. A Vorthak garbage hauler has thicker armor." "Yes, Grand Admiral." The old admiral set the tablet down and walked closer to the viewing screen. The stars beyond the glass were cold and bright. Somewhere out there, in a small region of the outer rim, these humans had begun expanding into space the Vorthak had claimed centuries ago. They were building colonies. They were drawing borders. They were, in their primitive way, declaring themselves a power. It was time to teach them a lesson. "Call the War Council," Kreshvanar said. "I want a punitive expedition prepared. 30 capital ships, 200 escorts. We will go to their borders and we will show them what a real military looks like. At once, Grand Admiral." Tovak hurried away. Kreshvanar remained at the viewing screen, watching the stars. He felt almost sorry for these humans. They were young. They were trying. But they had made the same mistake every dying species made before them. They had not understood the deepest truth of war. Walls win. Walls always win. The War Council met 3 days later in the Hall of Spires, on the Vorthak homeworld. 8 high admirals sat around a great round table, carved from black volcanic stone. Kreshvanar stood at the head of the table, presenting the human fleet data on a large floating display. "As you can see," he said, "the human ships are essentially unarmored. Their largest warship, which they call a cruiser, has a hull mass less than 1/10 that of our smallest frigate. Their weapons appear to be primarily missile launchers, and some kind of long rail structure running along the spine of each ship." "What is that rail?" asked High Admiral Vothkal, the oldest member of the council. "Our analysts believe it is a communication array, possibly a sensor system. The humans seem to be a species obsessed with radio technology. They broadcast everything. Their entire civilization screams across the radio bands like a flock of frightened birds." The other admirals chuckled. "And their tactics?" Vothkal asked. "Predictable. They form defensive lines around their colonies. They rely heavily on point defense systems and electronic warfare. Their ships are fast and maneuverable, but they cannot take a single solid hit. One plasma lance from a Vorthak dreadnought would cut their largest cruiser in half. Then this should be a simple operation. Yes, High Admiral, I expect the humans to surrender within the first engagement. Their losses will be total. Ours will be 0. The council voted unanimously. The expedition was approved. Kreshvanar would have his 30 capital ships and his 200 escorts. He would also have full authority to demand human surrender, occupy their colonies, and impose tribute terms. As the meeting ended, High Admiral Vothkal pulled Kreshvanar aside. The old admiral's scales were faded almost to gray with age. His voice was soft. "Be careful, my friend," Vothkal said. "Careful?" Kreshvanar tilted his head. "Of what? These humans are children playing with toy ships." "Perhaps. But I have lived a long time, and I have learned one thing. A species that spreads across the stars is never as weak as it looks. They survived something to get this far. They survived their own world, their own history, their own wars. Whatever they are not soft. Their ships are made of paper, Vothkal. Their ships, yes. But the question is not what their ships are made of. The question is what they are made of." Kreshvanar laughed and clapped the old admiral on the shoulder. "You worry too much. I will return in one cycle with their surrender in my hand. Save your concerns for real enemies." He walked away, his confidence undisturbed. Vothkal watched him go, and his ancient eyes were troubled. 3 weeks later, the Vorthak punitive fleet gathered above the homeworld. 230 ships, 500,000 crew, the single largest military force assembled in 2 centuries. Kreshvanar stood once more on the command deck of the Eternal Bulwark and gave the order to jump. The fleet vanished from Vorthak space and reappeared at the edge of the human-held Helios Gate system. Long-range scanners began to paint a picture of the system. A small human defensive force was already forming up to meet them. 12 cruisers, a handful of frigates, outnumbered nearly 20 to 1. Kreshvanar smiled. He looked once more at the strange long rails running down the spines of the human ships. He still wondered what they were. Communication arrays, his analysts had said. Probably for radio. The humans loved their radio. Yes, he thought. That must be it. He gave the order to advance. Captain Elena Vasquez sat in the command chair of the UNS Tycho Brahe and watched the alien fleet appear on her tactical display. Her ship was a heavy cruiser, 300 meters long, with a magnetic rail running almost the full length of her spine. She had been in the Earth Navy for 16 years. She had fought pirates in the asteroid belts. She had handled border skirmishes near the Centauri colonies. But she had never seen anything like this. The alien ships were huge. The smallest of them was bigger than her cruiser by a factor of 3. The largest, which her sensors marked as the enemy flagship, was a true monster, 2,000 meters long. Hull readings showed armor thickness her computer struggled to even classify. The thing looked like a flying mountain. "Sensor lock confirmed, Captain," her tactical officer reported. 230 enemy contacts. 30 capital class. 200 escorts. Vasquez nodded slowly. 12 cruisers and 8 frigates. Against this. The math was bad. The math was very bad. But the math was not the whole story. She tapped her command panel and opened a fleet-wide channel. "All ships, this is Vasquez. Hold formation. Charge the rails. All ships. Firing solution Theta. Repeat, Theta." Across the human defense line, 20 captains gave the same orders. Reactors spun up to full output. Capacitor banks began to charge, drawing power from every non-essential system. The long rails on the spines of the human ships began to hum with stored energy. Each ship was preparing to fire a single tungsten slug, 20 kilograms of dense metal, accelerated by magnetic force to 8% of the speed of light. In her academy days, Vasquez had been taught the physics. At those speeds, kinetic energy was the only thing that mattered. Armor became meaningless. Shields became meaningless. A railgun slug at relativistic velocities did not punch through walls. It simply ignored them. Her instructor had said something she had never forgotten. There is no defense against sufficient mass, moving at sufficient speed. There is only the question of where you choose to die. She watched the alien fleet advance. They were taking their time. They were not in any hurry. They thought this would be easy. "Enemy weapons charging, Captain," her tactical officer said. "Plasma lances, antimatter torpedoes, heavy beam batteries, point defense to full automatic, tactical AIs to combat mode." "Aye, Captain." The first alien salvo came 30 seconds later. It was beautiful, in a terrible way. Thousands of plasma bolts and dozens of antimatter warheads crossed the gap between the fleets. Each weapon was capable of cracking a small moon. Together, they should have wiped the human defense line out of existence. They did not. The human point defense network was something the Vorthak had never seen before. Hundreds of small turrets on each ship, controlled by tactical AIs running on cycles, measured in fractions of a millisecond. The AIs did not aim at the incoming weapons. They aimed at where the weapons would be in the future, calculated from trajectory and velocity. The defensive fire was not a single curtain of metal. It was a moving, breathing wall of prediction. 93% of the alien salvo was destroyed before reaching the human ships. The remaining 7% struck home. Plasma bolts splashed across human armor. The armor was not thick. The armor was not strong, by Vorthak standards. But it was clever. The outer layers were ablative, designed to vaporize on impact and carry the heat away with the expanding gas. The inner layers were heat-resistant ceramics. The structure of each plate was honeycombed to absorb shock. The human ships shook. A few systems went offline. One frigate lost its main sensor array. But not a single human ship was destroyed. Not one. Vasquez allowed herself a small smile. "Rails at full charge, Captain," her gunnery officer reported. "Firing solution locked." Fire. 12 cruisers fired at the same instant. 12 tungsten slugs left their rails at 8% of light speed. The rails themselves glowed white-hot from the discharge and required immediate cooling cycles. The slugs crossed the distance to the Vorthak fleet in less than 2 seconds. On the Vorthak flagship, sensor systems registered the incoming objects, but could not classify them as weapons. The threat assessment AI saw 12 small metal objects moving through space with no energy signature, no warhead, no exotic radiation. The AI categorized them as space debris. By the time a Vorthak officer thought to override the classification, it was already too late. The first slug struck the Vorthak dreadnought spire of conquest. It did not explode. There was no warhead. There was no plasma. There was only 20 kilograms of tungsten, moving at 24,000 kilometers per second. At those speeds, physics stops behaving the way intuition expects. The slug did not push through the armor. It did not crack the armor. It liquefied the armor. The crystalline alloy, which had taken Vorthak engineers 1,000 years to perfect, became something between a fluid and a plasma. The slug passed through 14 meters of hull, as if the hull were made of warm butter. It exited the other side of the ship, still moving at relativistic speed, and continued on into deep space, where it would travel for centuries before finally striking some distant rock. The spire of conquest did not explode. It was worse than that. The dreadnought had a tunnel through its center now, a tunnel of liquefied metal, vaporized atmosphere, and dead crew. The internal pressure of the ship vented through that tunnel, and the dreadnought began to come apart from the inside out. Decks collapsed. Reactors lost containment. Within 30 seconds, the great warship was a cloud of debris, drifting in space. Across the Vorthak fleet, similar tragedies were unfolding. 8 capital ships had been struck by the human salvo. 8 capital ships were dying. On the bridge of the Eternal Bulwark, Grand Admiral Kreshvanar stared at his tactical display in absolute silence. He could not understand what he was seeing. The humans had fired no weapons that his sensors could detect. There had been no plasma, no antimatter, no exotic radiation, and yet his ships were dying. "Report," he managed. "Grand Admiral," his tactical officer said, his voice shaking. "We are detecting kinetic strikes. Solid projectiles. They are moving at relativistic speeds." "Kinetic? You mean metal? They are throwing metal at us?" "Yes, Grand Admiral. That is impossible. That is primitive. No species uses kinetic weapons in modern space combat. The energy requirements are too high. The acceleration distances are too long. It cannot be done efficiently. Grand Admiral, with respect, they are doing it." Kreshvanar looked at his display again. The 8 burning hulks of his capital ships. The drifting debris fields where his proud dreadnoughts had been only minutes before. And he understood, in a single cold moment, that everything he had been taught about war was wrong. The humans fired again. This time, The human cruisers had recharged faster than Vorthak intelligence had predicted. Another 12 slugs crossed the gap. Another 6 Vorthak capital ships died. "Retreat," Kreshvanar whispered. "Order the fleet to retreat, immediately." The order went out. The Vorthak fleet broke formation and began to flee back toward jump distance. The humans did not pursue. They simply held their formation and watched the aliens go. By the time the last Vorthak ship jumped to safety, only 6 of the original 30 capital ships remained. Of the 200 escorts, fewer than 70 survived. In 90 seconds of combat, the Vorthak Empire had lost more ships than in the previous 200 years combined. Captain Vasquez watched the aliens flee and let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "Get me a line to Earth Command," she said. "I have a report to file." The news of the disaster at Helios Gate reached the Vorthak homeworld 3 days before the surviving fleet returned. Long-range communication relays carried the report ahead of the wounded ships. By the time Grand Admiral Kreshvanar's flagship limped back into orbit, the entire empire was in a state of shock. The Council of Spires met in emergency session. The Great Hall was filled with admirals, scientists, and high politicians. Voices were raised. Accusations flew. Some called for Kreshvanar to be executed for his failure. Others demanded an immediate full-scale invasion of human space. Most simply wanted to understand what had happened. High Admiral Vothkal, the oldest member of the council, stood and silenced the room with a raised hand. "Enough," the old admiral said. His voice was soft, but it carried. "Shouting will not bring back our ships. Shouting will not bring back our dead. We must understand what has happened before we decide what to do next." He turned to a group of scientists who had been quietly waiting at the edge of the chamber. "Chief Engineer Maravex, you have studied the battle data. Tell us what the humans did to our fleet." A small Vorthak engineer stepped forward. Her scales were pale blue, marking her as a member of the scientific cast. She held a data tablet in her trembling hands. "High Admiral, members of the Council, the humans used a weapon called a railgun. The principle is simple. 2 parallel rails carry an electric current. A conductive projectile is placed between the rails. When the current flows, magnetic forces push the projectile forward. With enough power and a long enough rail, the projectile can be accelerated to extreme speeds." "How extreme?" Vothkal asked. "Our analysis of the battle data suggests the human projectiles were moving at approximately 8% of the speed of light, 24,000 kilometers per second. A murmur ran through the chamber. The numbers were almost impossible to comprehend. "At those speeds," Maravex continued, "the kinetic energy of even a small projectile becomes catastrophic. A 20-kilogram tungsten slug at 8% light speed carries energy equivalent to several hundred megatons of conventional explosives. But the energy is not delivered through a chemical reaction. It is delivered through pure motion, through mass and velocity. And our armor cannot stop it?" one of the admirals demanded. Maravex hesitated. Then she spoke the truth. "No armor can stop it, not ours, not any that we know how to build. At those velocities, the projectile and the armor both behave like fluids on impact. The kinetic energy is so great that the molecular bonds of the armor simply cannot resist. There is no material in the known galaxy that can stop a relativistic kinetic strike. The only defenses are to never be hit, or to destroy the projectile before it reaches you." The chamber fell silent. The implications were staggering. For 3,000 years, Vorthak military doctrine had been built on the supremacy of armor, and now this small engineer was telling them that armor was meaningless. "Why have we never developed such weapons ourselves?" Vothkal asked. Maravex looked uncomfortable. "High Admiral, the Vorthak considered kinetic weapons centuries ago and rejected them. The reasons were practical. Kinetic weapons require enormous power generation. They require long acceleration distances, which means long ships. They require advanced cooling systems for the rails. They require sophisticated targeting computers to hit a moving target at extreme range. Most importantly, they were considered crude. Energy weapons were seen as more elegant, more civilized. And the humans? The humans, it appears, did not share our cultural prejudice. They have spent the past 2 centuries refining kinetic weapons technology. While we built thicker armor, they built faster projectiles. The fundamental difference in our approaches was philosophical. We asked, how do we survive being hit? They asked, how hard can we hit? Vothkal was silent for a long moment. Then he turned to the rest of the council. This is what I feared. The humans are not a primitive species. They have followed a different path of development, a path we considered beneath us. And now we discover that their path is more dangerous than ours. Then we must follow their path, declared one of the younger admirals. We must build our own railguns. That is one option, Vothkal said carefully. But it would take years. Decades, perhaps. The humans have a head start of 2 centuries. They will not wait for us to catch up. Then what do we do? The young admiral demanded. Several voices rose at once. Some called for diplomacy. Some called for retreat from human borders. Most called for what the Vorthak had always called for in times of crisis. More armor. Thicker walls. Better defenses. Engineer Maravex tried to speak. High Admirals, I must caution against simply increasing armor thickness. The fundamental physics. She was shouted down. The council was not interested in physics. The council was interested in tradition. The council had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years through the doctrine of walls, and the council would not abandon that doctrine because of one defeat. The decision was made by majority vote. The Empire would commission a new class of warship, the Aegis class Super Dreadnought. Each ship would have a hull thickness approaching 60 meters. Each ship would be equipped with reactive crystalline matrices, magnetic deflection fields, and ablative sacrificial plating. The Aegis would be the most heavily armored warship ever conceived by any species. It would be invincible. The Vorthak way had worked for 3,000 years. It would work again. A small group of engineers tried to argue otherwise. They pointed out that armor thickness alone could not solve the problem. They suggested investing in speed and maneuverability. They suggested developing kinetic weapons of their own. They were politely thanked for their input. Then they were reassigned to remote research stations, far from the centers of power. Engineer Maravex was among them. She accepted her reassignment in silence. Before she left the homeworld, she sent a private message to her family. They are not listening. They will build bigger walls, and the humans will simply build longer rails. I have seen the future, and it is full of debris. While the Vorthak Empire prepared for what it believed would be its great triumph, the situation on Earth was very different. Captain Elena Vasquez had been promoted to admiral within a week of her victory at Helios Gate. She now commanded the Second Fleet, headquartered at the orbital station above Earth. The promotion ceremony had been brief. There was no time for celebration. The war was not over. Everyone knew the Vorthak would return. She sat in her new office and reviewed the after-action data with her senior staff. On the wall behind her was a small framed photograph of her grandfather, who had served in the navies of Earth long before humanity ever reached the stars. The old man had taught her something when she was a child. He had told her that the most important question in any war was not, can we win the next battle? The most important question was, what will the enemy do next? They will build thicker walls, she said to her staff. How can you be sure, Admiral? Asked her chief of staff. Because they have built walls for 3,000 years. It is who they are. They will not change that overnight. They will assume the answer is more armor. They will build something massive and heavy and slow. And they will believe it is invincible. And our response? Vasquez tapped a button on her console. A schematic appeared in the air above her desk. It showed a new class of human cruiser. The ship was longer than the Tycho Brahe, sleeker. The rail running along its spine was nearly the full length of the hull, kilometers long, with magnetic accelerator coils stacked in series. This is the Ad Astra class, she said. The next generation. The new rails will fire at 15% of light speed, almost twice as fast as what we used at Helios Gate. The kinetic energy will be quadrupled. The room was silent. How long until the first ship is operational? Her chief of staff asked. 2 years. The shipyards are already at work. We will be ready before they are. She looked once more at the photograph of her grandfather. The old man was smiling in the picture. He had always smiled. "What will the enemy do next?" he had asked. "They will build thicker walls," she answered silently. "And we will build longer rails." 2 years passed. In Vorthak space, the great shipyards worked day and night. The Aegis-class super-dreadnoughts rose from their construction docks like vast metal mountains. Each ship was a marvel of engineering. Each ship was the heaviest warship ever built by any species in the known galaxy. 40 of them were completed. 500 escort vessels were assigned to support them. In human space, the shipyards were quieter. The new Ad Astra-class cruisers were sleek and fast and elegant. They did not look like fortress ships. They looked like spears, long, sharp, and pointed. The rails running along their spines stretched almost the full length of each hull. The magnetic coils were arranged in stages, each one accelerating the projectile faster than the last. The first prototype had achieved a muzzle velocity of 45,000 kilometers per second, 15% of the speed of light. Grand Admiral Kreshvanar had been given one final command opportunity. The Council of Spires had decided that he would lead the second expedition against humanity. If he succeeded, his honor would be restored. If he failed, he would be expected to take his own life upon his return. Kreshvanar accepted these terms without complaint. He was a Vorthak admiral. He understood the price of failure. The new fleet gathered above the Vorthak homeworld. 40 Aegis-class super-dreadnoughts, 500 escorts, the largest, most powerful military force in Vorthak history. Kreshvanar stood on the command deck of his new flagship, the Inviolate Wall, and looked out at the assembled ships. The Inviolate Wall was a true monster of war. 3,000 meters long, 60 meters of crystalline armor at its thickest point, 40 layers of reactive plating, internal magnetic fields powerful enough to deflect small asteroids. The admiral allowed himself a moment of confidence. This time, he thought, would be different. This time, the humans would face a real fortress. This time, the walls would hold. He gave the order to jump. The fleet vanished from Vorthak space and reappeared on the edge of the human-held Threnody system. Threnody was a colony world of 40 million humans, a relatively young settlement, a high-value target. The Vorthak Intelligence Service had selected it specifically to draw out the human fleet. The bait worked. As the Vorthak Armada moved toward the inner system, long-range scanners detected a human fleet forming up to defend the colony. 40 heavy cruisers, 250 escorts. Outnumbered, as before, but not as badly as at Helios Gate. Kreshvanar studied the human formation on his tactical display. The new human cruisers looked different from the ones he had faced 2 years before. Longer. The rails were definitely longer. He felt a small flicker of unease, but he pushed it down. His ships were 60 meters thick now. 60 meters. No projectile could penetrate that. The humans had improved their guns. The Vorthak had improved their walls. The walls would win, as they always did. The flagship of the human fleet was the UNS Ad Astra, commanded by Admiral Elena Vasquez. She watched the Vorthak Armada advance on her tactical display. The new alien super-dreadnoughts were unbelievable. Each one was larger than anything she had ever seen. The hull readings showed armor thicknesses she would have laughed at in academy training as physically absurd. And yet here they were. Real ships. 60 meters of armor. 40 of them. Coming for her colony. She felt no fear. Only a calm, professional certainty. She opened a fleet-wide channel. All ships. This is Vasquez. Hold formation. Charge the rails. All ships. Firing solution. Omega. Long-range engagement. Repeat. Omega. Across the human fleet, captains nodded grimly and gave their orders. Reactors spun up. Capacitor banks began to charge. The new rails, longer than ever before, began to hum with power. The cruisers were still well outside the engagement range that the Vorthak had calculated for kinetic weapons. The Vorthak fleet had not yet bothered to begin its own firing sequences. They believed they had time. They did not. Rails at full charge, Admiral, her gunnery officer reported. Solution locked. We are well within new engagement parameters. Fire. 40 human cruisers fired at the same instant. 40 tungsten slugs left their rails at 15% of light speed. The slugs were larger now, 25 kilograms each. The rails were longer. The acceleration was greater. The kinetic energy delivered to each target would be more than 4 times what had destroyed the Vorthak ships at Helios Gate. The slugs crossed the distance in less than a second. On the bridge of the Inviolate Wall, Grand Admiral Kreshvinar saw the incoming fire only a moment before it arrived. His threat detection AI, updated since Helios Gate, now correctly identified relativistic kinetic projectiles. But identification was not defense. Knowing what was coming did not stop it from coming. The first slug struck the Vorthak super-dreadnought mountain of 8 spires. The reactive plating triggered, just as it had been designed to. Explosive charges fired outward to disrupt incoming projectiles. The plating worked perfectly against conventional weapons. Against a tungsten slug at 45,000 kilometers per second, it might as well have been wet paper. The slug passed through the reactive plating without slowing in any meaningful way. It struck the main armor. 60 meters of crystalline alloy. The greatest armor ever built. It delayed the slug by perhaps 100 milliseconds. The slug punched through the mountain of 8 spires from one end to the other. It exited the rear of the ship, still moving at relativistic speed. The super dreadnought, like the spire of conquest before it, did not explode. It came apart from the inside out as its internal pressure vented through the tunnel of liquefied metal. Across the Vorthak fleet, the same horror unfolded 40 times. Some super dreadnoughts were struck cleanly through the spine. Others took hits to the reactor sections and lost containment. A few were bisected so cleanly that the two halves drifted apart, still firing their weapons, the crews not yet aware that they were already dead. The Inviolate Wall itself took a hit. A single railgun round passed through the bridge tower so close to Kreshvinar that the displaced air slammed him into a bulkhead. The slug had not been aimed at him. The slug had been aimed at the reactor. The reactor died a moment later. The flagship's lights went out across every deck. Emergency power kicked in. Battle damage reports began flooding the command system. Kreshvinar pulled himself up from the deck. His scales were torn and bleeding. His vision was blurred. He stared at his tactical display. In 10 seconds of combat, 26 of his 40 super dreadnoughts had been destroyed. The human cruisers were already recharging for a second volley. He watched the data flow in. He watched his fleet die around him. And in that moment, finally, after 3,000 years of Vorthak doctrine, after a lifetime of perfect faith in the supremacy of armor, the old admiral understood. The humans had never built walls because they had understood, somewhere deep in their species' history, that walls cannot exist against sufficient velocity. There is no thickness of armor that defeats a fast enough projectile. The math does not allow it. The physics does not allow it. The Vorthak had spent 3,000 years solving the wrong problem. They had asked how to survive being hit. The humans had asked how hard they could hit. One question had a ceiling. The other did not. "Retreat," Kreshvinar whispered through bloodied lips. "Order the fleet to retreat." "Grand Admiral," his communications officer said, weeping openly. "There is no fleet left to retreat." He looked at his display again. Of 40 super dreadnoughts, only 8 remained operational. Of 500 escorts, fewer than 100 still flew. The second human volley was about to land. "Then signal surrender," he said. "Surrender to the humans. Tell them we are finished." The signal went out. The remaining Vorthak ships powered down their weapons and began broadcasting on every frequency. The human fleet held its fire. Admiral Vasquez watched the alien fleet break and surrender, and she felt no joy, only a deep tiredness. She had known this would happen. She had planned for it. She had built her ships and trained her crews for exactly this moment. But knowing was not the same as feeling. 40,000 alien beings had just died in her opening volley. She was responsible for all of it. "Open a channel to the Vorthak flagship," she said quietly. "We need to discuss terms." The peace negotiations took place aboard a neutral station, orbiting a small star halfway between human and Vorthak space. Admiral Elena Vasquez represented Earth. Grand Admiral Kreshvinar, broken in body and spirit, represented the Vorthak Empire. The terms surprised everyone. Vasquez did not demand the surrender of Vorthak space. She did not demand tribute. She did not demand the disarming of the Vorthak fleet. She demanded only three things: open trade between the two civilizations, demilitarized borders along contested space, and the right of humanity to colonize uncontested worlds without Vorthak interference. Kreshvanar listened to the terms in silence. He had expected to be enslaved. He had expected his species to be reduced to a vassal state. He had expected the humans to do what the Vorthak themselves would have done in their position. Instead, these strange aliens were offering peace. Real peace. Equal peace. Why? He finally asked through the translator. We attacked you. Twice. We killed your people. We tried to take your colonies. By every law of war I understand, we deserve to be destroyed. Why are you offering us this? Vasquez looked at the old admiral for a long moment. His scales were bandaged. One of his 4 eyes was permanently blind. He looked very old and very tired. Because we have no interest in ruling your worlds, she said. We have no interest in your tribute. We have stars enough of our own. We have problems enough of our own. The galaxy is large. There is room for both of us. That is not how empires think. We are not an empire, Vasquez said. We are something else. Something your people have not yet had the chance to understand. Kreshvanar signed the treaty that day. The war was over. The decades that followed saw great changes for both civilizations. The Vorthak Empire, freed from its 3,000-year obsession with armor, began to rethink everything. The old Council of Spires was dissolved. A new generation of leaders came to power, many of them the same engineers and scientists who had been silenced before the war. Engineer Maravex was recalled from her exile and placed in charge of the new Vorthak military research program. She was not interested in building bigger walls. She was interested in asking better questions. The Vorthak began to study velocity. They began to study mathematics. They began to study, for the first time in their long history, the works of human physicists. Some of the old admirals called this surrender. Most of the younger Vorthak called it learning. The two civilizations established formal trade relations. Vorthak ships, slowly, began to appear in human ports. Human ships, slowly, began to visit Vorthak worlds. The peace held. Grand Admiral Kreshvanar did not take his own life upon his return, despite the old terms of his command. The new Vorthak government had no interest in such customs. He was retired with full honors and given a quiet estate on a small moon. He spent his remaining years writing. His memoir, published 20 years after the war, became required reading for every officer in the new Vorthak military. The book had a single dedication, in human standard. To the children of velocity, who taught us that walls fall. In the final year of his life, the old admiral traveled to a neutral world to visit a museum. He had read about the museum in a human journal. It contained a special exhibit that he had wanted to see for many years. The museum was on a small terraformed planet jointly administered by humans, Vorthak, and 3 other species. It was a quiet place. Few visitors came. Kreshvanar walked slowly through the halls, leaning on a metal staff. His scales had faded from green to gray. His remaining eyes were dim, but his mind was as sharp as it had ever been. He found the exhibit he had come to see in a small room near the back of the human wing. It was a simple display. A glass case. Inside the case was a model. A cutaway diorama of an early Earth weapon. The plaque called it a cannon. 21st century, by human dating. The model showed the weapon's structure in cross-section. An iron tube. A chamber for chemical propellant. A round iron ball that would be launched by the explosion of the propellant. It was, by any standard, a primitive weapon. The kind of weapon a child might draw in a history book. The kind of weapon that any spacefaring civilization would consider beneath their notice. Kreshvanar stood before the case for a very long time. The plaque beneath the model was written in many languages. He read the human inscription, translated into his own language by his eye implants. This weapon's descendants conquered a galaxy. There is no wall thick enough. There is only the question of how fast the hammer is moving. He thought of his 3,000 years of Vorthak history. He thought of the proud admirals of his youth, who had taught him that armor was supremacy. He thought of the great dreadnoughts of his prime, with their 40 meters of crystalline alloy. He thought of the Aegis-class super dreadnoughts that had been built to be invincible, and which had died at Threnody in less than 10 seconds. He thought of the question his species had asked for 30 centuries. How do we survive being hit? And he thought of the question the humans had asked. How hard can we hit? One question, he understood now, had a ceiling. Armor could only be so thick. Materials had limits. Power had limits. Even the most clever engineering ran into the hard walls of physics. The other question had no ceiling. Velocity had no maximum, only the speed of light. And the humans had been climbing toward that limit, with patient and ferocious dedication for centuries. There was no point at which they would stop. There was no thickness of wall that would ever defeat them. The Vorthak had asked the wrong question. They had asked it for a very long time. The old admiral bowed his head before the simple iron cannon. It was, he thought, the most honest weapon he had ever seen. It made no pretense of elegance. It made no claim to civilization. It simply asked one question and gave one answer. How hard can I hit? This hard. He left the museum and returned to his estate. He died 3 months later, in his sleep. His memoir was already in its 18th printing. Centuries passed. The treaty between humanity and the Vorthak Empire held through generations. The two civilizations did not become friends, exactly. They became something more useful. They became neighbors. They traded. They sometimes argued. They did not go to war again. On Earth, the solar shipyards continued their quiet work. Admiral Vasquez had been dead for 150 years. Her name was carved on a memorial wall on the orbital station that had once been her headquarters. She had been honored as a hero of the war and as the architect of the long peace. The schools taught children about her even now. Her great-great-granddaughter worked at the shipyards. Her name was Captain May Vasquez, and she was a chief engineer on the prototype design team. The new prototype was very long, longer than any cruiser ever built. The rails running along its spine stretched for nearly 20 kilometers, with magnetic accelerator coils stacked in stages that no previous engineer had attempted. The projected muzzle velocity was 30% of the speed of light. A young engineer working under May Vasquez paused one day during testing and asked her supervisor a question. "Captain, I do not understand. Why are we still building these things? The war ended generations ago. The galaxy is at peace. We have no enemies that justify weapons like this." May Vasquez looked at the great rails of the new prototype. She thought about her great-great-grandmother, whose name was on the memorial wall. She thought about the old Vorthak admiral whose memoir she had read in school. She smiled. "Because somewhere out there," she said quietly, "somebody is still building walls." The young engineer did not understand at first. But she would, in time. The prototype fired its first test round the next morning. The slug crossed the test range in a flash too fast for any unaided eye to follow. It struck the target at 30% of light speed. There was no explosion. There was no flash. There was only a target, and then no target, and then a small cloud of vapor where the target had been. The engineers cheered. In a corner of the testing facility, a small bronze plaque had been mounted on the wall. The plaque had been there for over a century. It had been placed there by Admiral Elena Vasquez herself, on the day the first Ad Astra-class cruiser had been launched. The inscription was simple. There is no wall thick enough. There is only the question of how fast the hammer is moving. And somewhere, in the distant darkness between the stars, the slug fired that morning continued onward at 30% of light speed. It would travel for thousands of years. It would never stop. It would never slow down. If, someday, in some distant time, it found a wall to hit, the wall would lose. The wall always loses. The hammer simply has to be fast enough.